Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. Like I said, my name is K. Adam White. You can call me Kadam. I work at a company called HumanMade, building really large-scale WordPress sites, integrating WordPress with other applications, building React frontends on top of it. And my journey with WordPress mirrors my journey with the web development profession as a whole. I learned how to code by building WordPress sites. I'm actually curious, how many people here have gotten started in some way by developing some WordPress sites? A couple of us. Who's built a WordPress site or worked on a WordPress site at some point in their career? That's a good half of the audience. It's pretty pervasive. And I think it's a really interesting case study in how communities grow and develop. When I was at JSConf EU, I actually had the idea for this talk during a conversation at the after party because I was talking to someone and said, oh, I work with WordPress. And you could kind of see their eyes glaze over a little bit. You could see them thinking, oh, well, what are you doing at JavaScript Europe, JSConf Europe? And so I elaborated. I said I build React frontends and I do a lot of API integration work with it. And then then their ears perked up. They said, wait, there's an API in WordPress. You can use React with WordPress. Well, yeah, you can use WordPress with everything. People do. And then we have to be employed to sometimes clean up that mess. If you are one of the people in the audience who raised their hands saying you've worked with WordPress or you've encountered it in your career, you might know that the title of my talk is actually a lie. WordPress is not JavaScript. WordPress is 15-year-old PHP software. WordPress, moreover, is 15-year-old PHP software that actually predates the modern concept of the JavaScript web application. It goes back. When WordPress was the first commit to WordPress was actually ported code from a previous blog called B2 Cafe Log. Matt Mullenweg had been using that. The maintainer discontinued it, story we all know. He thought, well, this is GPL, this is open source, I can fork it, I can create something new. So on April 1st, 2003, he initialized an SVN repo and committed some of the code from B2. That first day, there was some inline scripts in WordPress. JavaScript has been present from the start. He gained a partner in crime later that month. A man named Mike Little joined the project, also interested in trying to keep this blogging platform that they've been interested in moving forward. I now have the honor to call Mike a colleague of mine at HumanMade. And so on the 21st of April, 2003, the first actual JavaScript file was committed to WordPress. And that was also ported from B2 Cafe Log. The JavaScript didn't do very much at the time. Because JavaScript in general did not do much at the time. As you saw in Kelly's talk before this, we were before widespread penetration even of XML HTTP requests. A lot of the APIs that we've come to depend upon did not exist yet. And when we go through and we figure out what tools we want to use to solve a problem, we're going to draw from what we know. And so of course WordPress isn't a JavaScript application. There was no such thing. It grew and it evolved as a PHP application, and over time, I'm actually going to skip through that. What WordPress means in different contexts is actually a little bit confusing. There's WordPress.com, which is run by a company called Automatic, which was founded by Matt Mullenweg, the co-founder of WordPress. There's WordPress, also known as WordPress.org, to differentiate which is the open source software itself, and then there's a foundation that is dedicated to maintaining the goals of the project, which are to democratize publishing and to keep the project running as a good option for people to publish on the web in perpetuity. But once we get over these initial days, we get into this history of JavaScript and WordPress, where despite the reputation it's gained lately, we've always been trying to stay current. jQuery came out in 2006. It was added very early in 2007 to WordPress. Backbone was actually added to WordPress at version 0.9.2. Backbone took a while to hit 1.0, but the API stabilized pretty early, and it became useful inside WordPress for building interesting features, like a live preview customizer that was released in 2012, and a media library that would let people more effectively manage their media. So by the end of 2012, after WordPress releases 3.4 Grant Green and 3.5 Elvin Jones, I don't have as much pop music as Kelly did, but all of the WordPress releases are named after jazz musicians. We had a couple individual JavaScript apps running in WordPress, and they were providing tremendous benefit to the people that wanted to use this tool to publish online. They were all, however, built upon a somewhat flimsy foundation, which was this file admin.ajax.php. All of the Ajax interactivity in WordPress was running through one point of contact, just sending post requests to one PHP file, which would provide custom responses based on the string action flag that you passed in. And this was not a problem for most of the WordPress developers, because most WordPress developers were not necessarily computer science department trained engineers who had a good sense of architecture. They wanted to solve a problem, they had a tool to do it, they were looking around on the internet to see what the right solution to their problem was, who else had run into those things, how they had solved them, learning by example. And this is what I call the WordPress way. People use this term to mean different things. When I say it, I mean curiosity, having a problem, trying to find a direct solution to it. And reaching for things like Backbone and jQuery, because they are what is provided inside WordPress, introduced a generation of web developers, myself included, to the possibilities that JavaScript has to offer. But eventually, as we learned a little bit, left the WordPress community, in my case I went to work at a company that specialized in Node and front-end JavaScript, we learned that there were more powerful ways of doing things, and that there were other solutions that had been pioneered by other platforms. And we thought, we'd like to bring some of these back to WordPress. We'd like to take things like a REST API and make that something that's available natively inside WordPress. So in 2013, a developer in Australia named Ryan McHugh did a Google Summer of Code project to prototype what a WordPress REST API might look like. If you're familiar with WordPress, it has a huge plugin ecosystem. There's sort of the choice paralysis problem that I had before NPM came on the scene. What do you want to do? There's 3 plugins to solve it. Which one do you pick? Who knows? Plugins actually provided, at this point, several different options for getting structured JSON access to your data in your database, but they were all largely tailored to specific needs, and no one had sat down and thought, what would something that was designed from the ground up to be a part of core and serve the full use cases of a platform as broad as WordPress, which as of this week I think is measured at somewhere around 31% of major websites across the internet, which is wild. What would a REST API for that look like? How can we get our WordPress content and flow it in to all of these different environments and different types of application that we want to build, whether that is a server-rendered thing on a different server, or a mobile app, or a single-page app of some variety. And this was developed as a plugin, this API. I actually joined the project around the time when I was working on a Node application, and in the 11th hour we were told we had to add a blog to it. In 2014, there weren't many good Node blogging options, and so having some previous experience with WordPress, and knowing a little bit about the development of the API, we were actually able to bolt and rivet WordPress onto the side of our stack so that the editors on the team got a tried and true editing interface, and we were able to pull all of that data into the Node and other back-end servers that we were trying to put together on this project. And so the REST API opened up a lot of possibility for WordPress, and it opened up a lot of possibility not just for the sorts of things that I was doing, where I was integrating WordPress with other solutions and other systems, but it gave the people maintaining WordPress the opportunity to say, what does the WordPress of the future look like? We're seeing all of this development around us with JavaScript. We've been using Backbone. It was a stable API. It was the right choice at the time, but there's been a lot of development since then, and the Backbone code that we have was in a very familiar JavaScript fashion, written in a very short period of time by one developer, and was difficult to maintain. And so, looking at the future of WordPress, there was a need to reevaluate the interfaces that we provided our users to make WordPress something that could continue providing a free and open alternative to platforms like Squarespace. And a project was started which came to be called Gutenberg. It's not a lightly chosen name. WordPress obviously has some debt to the idea of the printing press. This is going back to basics. This is saying, what is it about WordPress that makes it an interesting solution for so many people across the internet? How can we change the way that we think about our interfaces to serve this audience? And what technology do we need to get there? Gutenberg is a reinvention of the WordPress editor, which was traditionally a rich text field managed with TinyMCE. As developers building with WordPress, we've bolted more and more functionality onto this until it's almost unrecognizable. And so when we go back and we say we want to reinvent this, we're really getting to the meat of what it means to build a site and to have your own site on the internet, to figure out how you want to craft and share whatever it is that you want to publish, whether you are a writer or a photographer or a huge company managing your blog and your news presence. And so when we look at the possibilities about websites, when we look about how we can enable people to build the sites they see in their imagination, if they wanted to pick a template and have free ability to write and drop images within it, we had that already. What we didn't have was more complex layout options, the ability for developers to build reusable little blocks of components for things that we ran into over and over again, like an image with centered text on it. And to say, how can we take this block and make that something that can be reused in a very visual, very intuitive way? We wanted to make writing rich posts effortless. And as developers, everyone's familiar with the notion that WordPress is fairly old. There's a lot of outdated code in there. There is code in WordPress running today that was committed on April 1st, 2003. It is still there because it still works. It's been moved around. It's in different files. They're better structured, but it's still there. But sometimes that can be difficult to work with. So if we're reinventing these things, what technology can we choose? And when we choose technology, how do we do that in a responsible manner? Because a WordPress developer, as I said, is curious, and they're a learner, but they're also learning by example. They're copying, they're figuring out how things that they see work. And so if we choose a technology, we have to be darn sure that it's not going to let our community down. And that community ranges from some of the most experienced and dedicated PHP developers in the world to somebody who has never coded before and just really, really wishes that their site loaded a little bit differently, or that when you clicked on a button, something different happens, and they're curious enough to start Googling on Stack Overflow. When we got to this point in 2015, the average WordPress developer was not very JavaScript savvy. And so at a conference in Philadelphia, Matt Mullenweg told the community that they should consider learning JavaScript deeply. Those are his words. Because WordPress is for learners, people were, I think, more enthusiastic about this than they were taken aback. There was some trepidation. If you're predominantly familiar with CSS and PHP, you might, and HTML that you render with PHP because it's mostly a templating layer that saves you from the logic. You're going to be a little nervous about learning something as vast as JavaScript because you start Googling for it. Well, what is this? Well, it's the most widely used programming language in the world. That sounds good. What is it used for? Everything. Oh, heck. And so, as stewards of the platform, and I should say, I don't speak for the entirety of the WordPress community. I would never presume to do so. The perspective I share here today is of one person who's been involved predominantly in the work to put in this REST API and to think about how we can structure the data in WordPress so that we can better use it from different types of applications. But when we, the group of people around the world, thousands of us, who maintain WordPress, look at technology, we have to recognize that if we pick this stack, which we did, that's going to have an impact on what people go and try to learn. Even if we just ship something with WordPress, that can make a measurable impact on its market penetration. When we added responsive images in 2015, yes, you can see the day that WordPress 4.4 was released. These are small percentages, but this is a measurable increase of a platform, of a feature on the scale of the entire web platform as measured by the Chrome platform stats. That's a pretty big responsibility. So it's one thing for Automatic to say when they're building their new Calypso editor, which is an Electron app experience for editing on WordPress.com, it's one thing for them to choose React. It's quite another for us to say, can we use this in WordPress itself? And it raises questions about, for example, that patent clause issue we had. A year ago, last week actually, we were in the middle of a major brouhaha around the patent clause in React. The Apache Foundation earlier in the summer had announced that they weren't able to use it because they didn't consider it compatible with their licensing. And at about this time, on the 14th of September, Matt Mullenweg posted that we had drafted a post about announcing we were going to be using React. We had, I read it. And we couldn't post it. We couldn't publish it because we did not believe that using this tool would be a good choice for the community. Now, the Gutenberg project was in full swing at this point. There was a lot of development going on. And so there was a lot of investment already in React, in this tooling. And so we were looking at Preact, we were looking at other options. A lot of people in the community were advocating very hard for Vue. I still think that would have been an interesting thing to explore further, but I think it's hard to deny that, at least in the communities that we know in the US and Europe, which are predominantly involved in the development of WordPress, React has an advantage. And there was a lot of frustration that suddenly this was going to be taken away from us. Fortunately, a year ago tomorrow, yes, React announced that they were going to be relicensing, and Facebook announced that they were going to be relicensing these different libraries and providing them under a license that would be fully compatible with something GPL like WordPress. I'm not saying that this was a direct result of Matt or WordPress or any portion of this community, but when you have the scale of the platform that we do, your decisions can have really beneficial impacts if you consider them and if you really put the time into making those decisions well. The goal of WordPress is to democratize publishing, but by leading by example, if we do the best we can democratize software development as well. We can provide backdoors into the industry for people who are business owners or bloggers or site maintainers themselves who have the curiosity to begin to get involved. And if we show them that these are the tools that we believe are going to pave the way for the future, that gives them a leg up when they're trying to decide whether they want to dedicate more time to learning something, dedicate more time to trying to be a part of the community in this room. But that's also a lot to dump on people. You have to imagine that I am someone who knows a little bit of PHP and a little bit of CSS, and I've been told I need to learn JavaScript deeply, and I open the door to JavaScript and I see this buzzing mass of chaos that is the JavaScript world and the NPM repository, and I think, I don't know that I can do this. We need to find ways to introduce people to things gradually. And so the final thing that I'll share before I dive into the guts of how Gutenberg is actually going to work is the notion that we've been very mindful about the abstractions that we've put around things like React, around things like Webpack. I think that a lot of people who use Webpack and enjoy the experience are using it through a tool like Create React App that takes away the burden of putting together that configuration. Similarly, there's a lot of wiring that needs to be set in place in order to use React well, particularly in something like WordPress, where React is going to live in the core software, but plugins will need to be able to register their own components and modules and interoperate. So when we look at how we define a block, which is the core unit of content in the Gutenberg editor, it's through the lens of these abstractions. We're not importing React and get them down right there. We're importing a wrapper, create element, from a WordPress module. And we're using our own method, register block type, rather than my class extends React.component. We're saying, here's our title and our description. Interestingly, the double underscore method is for internationalization. We've been working at that problem for a long time. I really enjoyed the talk on it yesterday. I could do to learn a lot more about it. I think that the major thing I've taken away from being involved in conferences in Europe is how underappreciated internationalization is in the States. So definitely worth exploring and experimenting with for everyone in the room. We register our block, and then we can take this construct and we can give it a save method, and we can say, here is some JSX, or we can use normal function calls as well, because that create element can be called just the same way that React.element can. And we can say, when I save this block, if I have added this to a post, this is what I want it to look like. I want it to say, hello EmpireJS. And then when someone adds it to their post, and you've added some styles, that's what they see. To make it a little bit more interesting, we can go one step further and we can say, let's add an edit method to this constructor that we have here. And let's provide a rich text editor that they can use when they are rendering this out, so that we are able to go through and we can say, I want to be able to store a piece of information here. I want it to be the content of this post. And that editor is something that you can go and type in and adjust, and then you're going to get the live styling that the developers have provided to make sure that it looks the same way it's going to on the theme side, the front end of the site. And you can get it to the point where in your editor it looks the way you think it should. Then you can preview it, make sure it looks good on the front end, and hit publish. And you can actually have the published view be as similar or different from the back end as you want. If you were building some sort of data visualization component, a block that showed a graph, you could have an editor which provided a very complex UI to choose your data set, choose your representation of it, and then you could actually render out the SVG and have that be what is saved into the post so that there's no live JS running on the front end. This is a defensive abstraction. It's partially to make the burden of learning React a little bit simpler, because now someone who just wants to make their site work the way they think it should can learn one or two very specific functions and read their documentation and make something that they think works, knowing that they can reach for the full stack of power that React provides under the hood if they need it. But that, and in addition, as I mentioned earlier, that they don't have to be using JSX, they don't have to even have a build process, because since React is already part of the bundle that WordPress provides, you can access create element off of the global, and you can get going with your development right there without any of this other cruft and infrastructure that we have as an industry decided we need to build up around development to make it nicer for us once we know what we're doing. So keeping that abstraction in place and thinking about how we can extend it to things like Redux and provide modules that say, well, let's take Redux and let's add some additional layers on top of it to make it easier for us to model data that might need to be compartmentalized and coordinated across a different set of plugins and themes. Getting modules like WordPress.data. The WordPress project has published a lot of NPM modules this year, and there is a strong, strong desire for more interest and contribution from the JavaScript community. Because the goal is not to reinvent everything ourselves. The goal is to introduce good themes so that our developers can learn at the rate that works for them, and that we can make good choices that are going to help us avoid falling down some of the architectural tech debt pitfalls we've had in the past. So the Gutenberg editor is in active development. There was earlier a thought that it might end up getting merged into WordPress core. It's actually being developed as a standalone plugin on GitHub right now. There was a thought that it would be merged into core earlier this summer. We're still working on it, because there's more to be done. A lot of the architectural decisions around those themes that I've been describing are in place, but there's a lot of community standards, there's a lot of boilerplate, there's a lot of testing, there's a lot of outside input that we're still reaching for, and so it's a little early to say when it's going to land. But if we look at what the impact of it's going to be, once we released a new version of WordPress a few weeks ago that added a banner that people should try it, there was an outpouring of frustration and concern and uncertainty around the fact that we were changing this editing experience that was working for so many people around the world. That's a very real concern, and it's something that is definitely being heard and taken to heart. But when people talk about whether they think this is going to introduce huge rifts into the community or introduce forks of WordPress, I think that's probably not as big a concern. Because when a community splits off from something as large as WordPress, Ghost, for example, is a JavaScript-based CMS project that came directly out of the WordPress community when some people were dissatisfied with the status quo. It now coexists very happily alongside the rest of this. I think there's different priorities in different projects. If we end up in the short term having a fork or having some other variety of project that comes out of WordPress, I think it's going to be okay in the long run, because the ideas that work are going to end up being merged back together in some way, whatever that might look like. But the important part is that we make these technology decisions in a responsible way. We make sure that we're thinking through not just how we can make the burden of learning this technology easier for our existing community, but how we can defend against the churn and the growth of JavaScript. We had some really interesting conversations in Berlin with the React team around the fact that their deprecation policy is very different from ours. WordPress is very devoted to backwards compatibility. There has never been a release of WordPress that has required you to rewrite your entire site. React, however, moves very quickly, deprecates things on a very short cycle comparatively, and is not afraid to break things because they're pursuing a really interesting set of abstraction challenges. And they have the responsibility to their team and their interests to keep pushing forward. So I think that it's through communication that we can say, how do we take these different worlds and how do we put them into a place together where if we communicate, we can figure out a way to keep moving forward with something like React without endangering its usage inside something as widespread and slow-moving as a big ship like WordPress. And the way that we do that is by talking and by getting different people in the rooms together. So I'm part of the JavaScript community. I'm used to a room like this, but it would be great for a lot of you to start coming to WordPress events. They happen in every city around the world, almost every weekend. And while we're doing that, it's important to self-police as well. It's important for us to remember that this is where a good portion of our community comes from. The only place you get a senior developer is from an inexperienced developer. And we need to be incredibly welcoming to these people as they come into the room. I love the New York JavaScript community. We can be a little cliquey. We can be a little bit of an in crowd. And when I was going around JSConf EU with a colleague from the PHP community, she said to me, I'm really glad that I'm here with you because I wouldn't have been able to talk to any of those people probably, but they know you. And that's something I think that I'd like for us to get better at. The things that have gone well in WordPress, and I know I'm at time, are some really good technology decisions, picking what we genuinely believe to be best of breed right now, seeing our educator community internally step up to take on this challenge of how do you teach these people JavaScript in a way that works for them and for the project. How do you maintain backwards compatibility without breaking things? What do we need to learn about how to document our tools better to support different learning styles and different backgrounds? And document more. Remember where we came from when we're writing our documentation. Make sure it's findable. All of these things are incredibly important. And they're not challenges that are unique to WordPress. They're challenges we all face every day as web developers. There is not actually a WordPress community and a JavaScript community. There are JavaScript developers that know more about WordPress and less about WordPress, and vice versa. Our community is not a programming language or the technology decisions we make. It's the people involved in trying to achieve their dreams on the web. And we all have these perspectives on challenges that cut across our industry. If we put our heads together, I think that there's a lot that the JavaScript community at large could learn from a 15-year-old piece of PHP software. And I know that there is a lot that WordPress could learn from JavaScript. So I hope that we do it together. Thank you.